right, before I start my talk, I want to do something different because I often don't know if you understand anything I'm saying. So we're going to practice how you're going to tell me when I say, because I'll do this a lot, I'll say, does that make any sense? And everyone will just stare at me like this. Because, well, maybe that's the lights that makes you look like that. But I want to practice, just nod when I say, does this make sense? Or shake your head if it doesn't make sense. We're going to practice this. Today is Wednesday. Does that make sense? All right. See, this is great. Okay, so then, so to practice the negative, my favorite thing that Euler contributed to mathematics was relating trigonometric functions to Fourier transforms. That makes sense, right? No one's shaking their head. If you don't shake your head, I assume you don't understand, and I'm going to explain stuff in more detail. Fourier transforms. See, they're infinite sums that start. I don't actually remember how it works either. I shook my head at the. Anyway. All right, so I'm Dane Hammer. I have some thoughts on microservices, but why do you care what my thoughts are? I worked at Cerner for 8 years, right before any of this microservice stuff started happening. They're running a Mesos cluster and doing some cool stuff. Wish they would have told me they were going to do that. But I saw what was keeping us from starting on that path, so I feel like I have an understanding of where that becomes a challenge initially. And then recently I was a consultant at one of those big companies that uses letters for names. I'm not supposed to say that I worked with them, so I'll just call them the letter company. And now I work at Udacity. I went there a year ago, and 3 years ago they started switching from their giant monolith to a microservice architecture. And so I've come in at the tail. So the benefit of this talk is I feel like most of us don't get to come stand on stage and say, like, I did this thing, and I made this happen, and this is great, you should all do it. Most of us are like, hey, this guy that used to work here did this thing, and now I own it. How do I do this? So I'm definitely in that camp. And I mentioned the company names just so I can tell them apart. I'm not saying that Udacity's way of doing things is like the end-all, be-all. It's not. But it is a good touch point for like seeing it in production with microservices. So also, I've gathered a few of my personal entries from my diary over those times. My diary. I'm just going to read them to you when I put up this slide, okay? So, dear Jez, you guys write your personal diaries to Jez Humble, right? Like, I'm not the only one. That makes sense? No one? All right, Jez Humble, you should watch all his talks on YouTube. Anyway, he's like a DevOps person. Dear Jez, today I asked why they had started down the path of microservices a couple years ago. They told me a bunch of reasons that seem to be applicable this year. So I bring this up because initially, when we talk about microservices, they were all the rage a few years ago, right? Everyone was saying, you should use microservices, it'll save your engineering organization. And then a bunch of people did, and a bunch of people realized they shouldn't have, because it's a lot of work. There's a huge cost to just committing to this from wherever you're at. And you don't want to do microservices first. Everyone will tell you, you build a monolith first. You can't be successful without building a monolith. And then maybe you get lucky and you have the scale problems that Amazon and Netflix and Google have, but no one else, like, well, there's a few. But anyway, you know what I'm saying. But one thing I've seen over and over is this cost of how long it takes and what the opportunity cost is of committing to a microservice architecture and going all the way through that is just overlooked all the time. Because an org running a monolith successfully, or even like several of them, but like not this like crazy network-driven microservice architecture, they don't have an operations team and a structure for monitoring and alerting and managing that would facilitate a microservice architecture, and so they just kind of ignore that and say, well, we'll figure it out. I think that part is my second most important part. I'll get to my first most important part later. I think the operations of it is the second most important thing to nail with microservices from what I've seen when they do it right and when they do it wrong. But raise your hand if you're in a position to decide if your company goes down the path of microservices. We have 3. All right, I didn't assume anyone raised their hand. I figured you guys already know all this stuff. What do you need to learn from me about microservices? I didn't raise my hand. I'm not in that position. If you are, that's awesome. Please take pictures of all my slides and show them to your engineers. So whether you're already on the way there, you got a new job like I did, and you're like, oh, what did I get myself into? I want to start with just some things to watch out for, like deer or something. So here's the weaknesses, and I don't bring these up so that you can have a bunch of gripes for when those 3 guys tell you that you're doing microservices now. I do them to make you aware of risks you want to mitigate, things you want to, because at the end of the day, it's still freaking awesome. Like, I want to say all this, but at the same time, like, the kid in me thinks having like a microservice architecture is just freaking cool, because when I say, I'm giving a talk at DevOpsDays about microservices, people are like, oh, really? That's so progressive. Like, it's so cool. Like, it's fun and like bleeding edge. So all that, yes, you're probably going to do it if you want to, if those things attract you, because you get to use the newest. Everybody's telling us Kubernetes is going to change the world. How many? I wasn't listening earlier. 2 talks on Kubernetes already. I think we have a 3rd one. It's awesome. But these are the weaknesses I've seen, and if you don't mitigate them, they make moving to Kubernetes hell. Whether you developed it, whether you deployed it, whether you're on call, because dear Jez, last night I woke up at 3 a.m. because the alert for the thing was going off. I had never heard of the thing. I didn't know how to fix the thing. It fixed itself. So, first weakness that I see in my microservice experience is it is a lot harder to discover what's already out there. It is easy to duplicate effort because it creates this like disperse sharing of knowledge. There's like domain knowledge around a handful of microservices, but then there's a whole team that owns 3 others over here, and they're repeating half of their work because it's not all in the same code base anymore, right? Like, you can't just grep the repo and see, oh, here's all the instances that JSON was transformed, so I'll just use that same library. No. This team's like, no, we're going to use this really cool thing, we're not going to use JSON, and everybody else is like, what? gRPC? I find that one to be one of the first ones, because while microservices make it great for like a very small team of even like 1 person to go develop a new service and get it deployed to prod and get it monitored with the shared monitoring, and it's also very easy for them to do all that and never tell anyone. And so you're like, oh, the alert's going off for what is this? Because I'm on the platform team, so I'm on call for a whole bunch of things that I didn't write. Like, I'm sure everyone who's ever been on call, like, that's typically what on call means, is you're signing up to be the first punching bag. Other hidden costs. So we're at the tail end. We're 90% of the way at Udacity. I hope that we will kill off the monolith that was the end-all, be-all. It was front-end repo, back-end repos, the whole thing by the end of the year, maybe next quarter. It started 3 years ago, remember? Re-engineering the remaining stuff to be in a microservice just feels totally wasteful. But then having to own the operations of your entire services platform where everything runs, and then this skeleton of a giant Python or Rails app is also not great. So it's just that part's not fun. And apparently I'm learning this as I'm explaining this to you. I apparently focus on the fun things. It can feel a little wasteful there. And then I mentioned operations. I think it's one of the hardest things because the structure of your ops organization determines the success of your radical, what am I trying to say? The adoption of something as disruptive as a services platform that's going to run all these microservices is I feel like is constrained by how well operations can handle it as far as success and client experience. One of the constraints is like how well your ops team can allow you to do that, or if it is an ops team, right? It might just be some poor developers that got tricked. And then I think the last one is cross-cutting problems get harder in microservices, in my experience. So again, this is my experience. Somebody might have a totally different experience at Basho or some other place where they went all gung-ho on microservices. But the one I'm on, so I work on a team that owns the platform, and we own the core auth services. And the core auth services are now 3 microservices. But back in our monolithic app, it was just in a module, right? Microservices a lot of times starts as, hey, I've got these 15 modules in my code base. I'm going to make each one of them a microservice, right? Makes sense. Then I can iterate on them differently. I'm not constrained to the same technical requirements that the entire code base is, right? If I like Golang and I'm sick of Ruby, because I like Golang and I'm sick of Ruby. The big Python app we have right now with the front end and back end code, guess how hard it is, before all this happened, guess how hard it was to move through the authentication module and make a change to how session cookies were created and have every engineer in the organization benefit from that change. It was super simple. Most of the time, single git commit, atomic change that refactored all the touch points, ta-da. Guess how hard it is to do that after there's 3 different microservices? We just did this recently. We wanted to change how session cookies work. They're JWTs, and they have certain claims. We're going to add a new claim, and then other people will be able to use that new claim. And guess how long it takes every engineer in the company to consume that change? I did it in July, and it's not done yet. My most frequent Slack message is, why doesn't the session cookie do this thing it used to do? It gets harder to do those cross-cutting things because now every microservice that you spun off, remember we took a module, does that make sense? Took a module, made it a microservice. Seeing mostly nods. We learned from our training. That's good. Everyone else is ready for lunch. But yeah, all those microservices, they have to be redeployed to consume the new thing a lot of times. I mean, you can get really cool. Maybe next year I'll tell you how that works. Because we are curious about how to do this. The automation for I want to change all my services, we're putting a lot of hopes on ist.io or Istio or Istio. One of those, I don't know how to say it. But it's that thing that's really cool in Kubernetes. It's like, alpha, because that makes it fun. It's got to be alpha. They got to have breaking changes. But in Kubernetes, where you have the idea of multiple containers per service, instead of this like dedicated one container is the service, but the idea that you have pods, like we can have an Istio pod that will solve some of these cross-cutting concerns like tracing. Oh man, microservices is fun to trace. Like you called him, and he called her, and she called. What's this? Remember, it's going off. I'm in the middle of troubleshooting an alert, and I don't know half the services. Anyway, maybe I'll tell you how that works next year at DevOps Days, assuming they let me come back. All right, journal entry. Dear Jez, I started at Udacity yesterday, and today they had me run the production deploy. Our prod cluster is 15 servers, so I built 3 new ones, destroyed 3 old ones. On my second day, it took an hour. Freaking cool. Like, I just can't believe it. Like, when they told me, all right, Dane, you're going to watch the first one, and this is on my first day, and then on the second day, you're going to run it. And I'm going to run what? You're going to replace 20% of production cluster, and you're just going to let the new guy? I'm going to take a few minutes to just fire off all the technical details of this, because while my approach wasn't to be too technical on this, but to more be like, what are the common threads I've seen through bad microservices and good microservices, is I want you to know that this can work and be live in production and trust, like it works well enough that you let the new guy run the deployment on day 2. So we have a Mesos cluster, and can you make my notes scroll down to the bottom so I can remember what I was going to say? We have a Mesos cluster and a Marathon, Mesos and Marathon. We've got Console, Weaveworks, and HA Proxy that manage the container networking. But then all of that is managed with this deployment Docker image. We took Capgemini's Apollo. Capgemini is some consulting company that did this a bunch. And of course, we're on a fork now because they've abandoned it, because what are they doing? They're switching to Kubernetes. So we're on Mesos right now. We're going to switch to Kubernetes too, because, that's fun. But the deployment container, this bundle of bash scripts and Terraform modules and Ansible modules, lets us do things like, when I did the three changes, we had 15 Mesos agents that were of type A. That was running prod. Like when you're done, you're almost always at 15 type A, 0 type B. And so the way we manage it is we just bump type B to 3, run the automation. Terraform provisions 2, 3 EC2 instances, and puts them in the ELB, and then Ansible like reconfigures Mesos, reconfigures Marathon, reconfigures Console, right? And it's just a rolling change across all these services that need to know all their peers, because you were fine with 15, and you were fine at 18, and you can be in the middle as you move. Then we deploy one of those services that doesn't do much, but we can scale it to 100 and see a bunch of them spin up on these 3 new instances. So we'll see Mesos provision some resources there. And then just wait. Everything look good? Everything look healthy? All right, let's bump type A's down to 12, rerun the automation. Terraform takes them out of the ELB, destroys the EC2 instances. Ansible goes and reconfigures all our services in the cluster, and you're done. You now have 20% of the way done. You do that again tomorrow, you do that again tomorrow, you do that again tomorrow. And over 5 days, we replaced the entire production cluster. It was really cool, because this was boring maintenance that a lot of times I've seen no one ever do, because it's so hard to do this kind of change, where you can be halfway through Instead of like, I think a common approach is, well, let's go build a new prod cluster and we'll tell everyone to change the IP addresses in their config files and we'll be done, which is actually terrible and you find a bunch of networking setup that you never did. Anyway, I share this because I want you to know that this works and this is radically different than what I saw at the previous two places. And I have a note to take a drink of water, which I forgot to bring, but before I explain why that is, I want to talk about parallels I see outside of tech. In 1959, there was a challenge to build a human-powered aircraft. The idea that like huge wings and this guy's just going to pedal and it's going to fly. Somebody's like, somebody can make that. Whoever figures it out gets $100,000. And no one figured it out for 18 years. Because not that no one was trying, it was because the academic professor types that were trying to solve this, they would go design this really cool, intricate system with all these trusses and safety mechanisms and made the plane really heavy. And the guy that's figured it out, they would work on this for the whole school year. They'd get their graduate students to come in and build it, get one of their graduate students to fly it and crash and fail, and then they would start over again. So you get like a year of iteration time. Takes a year to do another iteration. And the guy that solved it, his iteration time was in hours. He threw out the safety, he threw out the whatever, because his goal was just, I'm going to fly 10 feet off the ground, and I'll just jump out, which is crazy. But he did it. In under 6 months, he solved the problem, won the prize. And I think the key takeaway there is his iteration time, the time it took him to try a new version of the product, was like the key differentiator between all the people that he was competing with. And he was like some nobody. He was just like, oh yeah, I've built hang gliders. I can probably build that. And a similar thing is Elon Musk and the Tesla factory. I mean, whatever inane thing old Muskie has said recently, forget that, but like years ago when he was like starting Tesla, he had mentioned that his goal wasn't to build a new car, it was to build a new car factory. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's something some business type would say. But no, it's totally true. Like the way you build the builder instead of the built can sometimes be the more important thing. And I think when we come back to microservices and service platforms in general, I think this applies to any time you have some sort of shared platform, even a shared library. The way you make the next iteration of the thing that doesn't do anything, of the thing that allows other people to do stuff, the way you make the next iteration of that is probably more important than ever building the first one. Did you plan on building it once and then just going over here and tweaking this and going, oh, okay, I'll just throw more RAM at it? Or is it its own deliverable? And then what does it mean if it's its own deliverable? The product that builds products should be a product. Like, it should be treated like any other software project. It should be, I mean, does this make sense, the idea of like the product that builds the product? Head shake, ha, sweet. I hope every other speaker benefits from this, by the way. I want everyone to practice this and be like always shaking their heads. Like, you got to do, let's all do it together. All right, next talk, when someone asks a question, we're all going to just like really over the top. Like, yeah. So with my previous agent change, I can use that same thing from scratch. I can go build a whole new thing in the platform in another VPC, in another AWS region, in another sub-account. There's a common thing. So I want to go put it over here and test on it. I want to go spin up the platform and put some services on it and just keep it totally isolated. Because it handles all that automation, building the next version is like, it's just as cheap as, no, that's not quite fair. It's really cheap to build a brand new one. It's almost just as cheap to change the existing one. There's always consideration in prod that you don't have when you're greenfield, which is why we have a name for greenfield. But this isn't about disaster recovery. I don't want to know what would happen with the RDS snapshots. I'm terrified of database snapshots. It's about the platform being its own deliverable. And at the big letter company, the product was not a deliverable. Anytime you wanted to, sorry, not the product, the platform was not a deliverable. The platform was just this thing that you had to go get working. It was like based on Cloud Foundry, or it was Cloud Foundry, and there was all this configuration and all of these integrated pieces that had all just been figured out when they got it running. So if you wanted to change one of those things, you had to go find a Brent, because the only book I've read in DevOps is the Phoenix Project, which one of the organizers was making fun of me about last night. He's like, did you just stop at the Phoenix Project? I'm like, yeah, I did. Like, done. It was a reiteration of another book, wasn't it? So you have to go find a Brent, and you'd be like, hey, Brent, I need to change, like, how many of these there are. There's only one right now, and that's not very HA. We need 3, and it needs to fail over. And you had to go find him because he was busy answering somebody else's question, tweaking some other knob. You definitely couldn't pull request the repo of Terraform modules and Ansible modules and make it happen from now on. Oh, that's what's fun with those manual tweaks, too. You guys ever had this? We had at Cerner where we needed to build the whole thing again in the UK. And it had different security requirements for like who was allowed on the box. So we made up all these new security rules first, and then we built the whole platform inside those security rules, and then found out how many times Brent had gone and fixed the thing. Because, well, we didn't have them written down, so nothing worked, and we spent like a month building a second version of the platform versus an hour where you just run the thing. Like, designing for how you are going to build the next version of your product is the thing. Every speaker says this. If you remember one thing from my talk, if you learn one thing, it's building the next version is the thing. I have one more analogy, which I will skip. No way I'm at 36 minutes. Is that right? No, it is not right. Just kidding, guys. Hey, try not. There's no one back there. I'm just actually pretending that so that it seems like it's not my fault. I have no idea where I'm at on time. How you build the products? No, this is too good. All right, so the spaceship, the thing on the launch pad, it goes into space and it burns up in the atmosphere except for the little bitty pod, unless there's a really bad failure and they all burn up in the atmosphere. The launch pad, the tower that's next to it, and the building that they're built in, which is bigger than the spaceship, it's the tallest building in Florida, I think, are the product. And then it happens to make spaceships. And then it makes new spaceships, right? Like, so we don't build them this way anymore. We built what are they called? The shuttles in there. We don't build those anymore. We build the other thing, the new one, the Mars one, the one that's going to go to Mars. Everything else is disposable, but how you change the platform, like I feel like so often, let me go back. I feel like so often we think about the spaceship as being the only thing that needs that level of attention. It's the only thing that needs to be treated with this rigor around engineering and how I'm going to own it and maintain it and monitor it. But the platform is probably more important because when you quit making Apollos and you start making space shuttles, like all those things that you did for Apollo have to go and get redone. You hope you don't have to rebuild you don't have to redo all the work like I was doing in the UK. Like, you don't have to do it all again, rediscover all of it. All right. How do you do that? I think the first thing is you treat the platform, the product that builds products, like another product. It should be continuously integrated. It should be automated, tested. It should be code reviewed. This is crazy. You should code review your configuration management code. You should test it. I know, right? It's a little aggressive. But I think another thing we think about, I know where we're at on time now, and it's not good. Do those things. They're great things to do. You're at a DevOps conference. We talk about this all the time. Do the same thing for your platform. I think we just forget it. You need to continuously integrate it. You need to acceptance test it. You need for a person to come join your team and be able to go make a change, just like a microservice. Microservices get this for free. This is why I say microservices are so awesome. I just said yesterday in a meeting, I'm just going to go spin up a new microservice for that. We're going to handle it, and then if we hate it, we can just throw it away. And my boss is like, that sounds perfect. And I'm like, I just wish I could do the same thing with a platform. It's like, I'm just going to go do Kubernetes, and if we don't like it, we'll just throw it away. Like, you can't do that. But like the human-propelled airplane, you have to spend more time on how you're going to do your next change, the next iteration of your solution for I need a services platform. It's more important than building the first one, which executives hate this. Where are you guys at on the proof of concept? We haven't made one. Oh, we've got whiteboard drawings for the whole wall, and we've erased them and done them again. Yeah, we got nothing to show. So go figure, use DevOps principles on your platform. Oh, one other thing. Mean time to recovery is similar to like mean time to, oh, I took it back. You want your platform to be roll-backable, just like any other service that you, like it's easy to design, like start the Docker container, it takes like 500 milliseconds, and then it sucks, roll it back. And like the only thing that was at risk was like that one microservice, right? Odds are it didn't kill anybody else. And well, sometimes they kill each other, but they don't. We're ignoring that. In the platform, you do have a little more risk of this. Like you need to not put everyone at risk. So it's even more important that the time it would take you to roll back a change is like as fast as time it takes to roll it out. And of course, I'm at a DevOps conference, so I got to talk about culture. Huh? Guys, this works on 2 levels. That's a culture slide. Does that make sense? A lot of this comes down to culture, but before you hear that and you're like, oh, God, Dane, I don't want to go get a new job in order to do these things. No. This is the stuff I saw at Letter Company and at Cerner. You can go change the culture. Like this, go back. This started as a Petri dish with gel in it, and somebody scratched it, and they stuck in there some bacteria. You want to be the scratcher bacteria sticker inner. Go be bacteria scratcher sticker inners at your company, and you will influence the culture, assuming that you're in a gel that accepts other cultures. So you got to be in a culture that cultures. I don't know how to say that. All right, real quick review. We talked about caution. You probably don't need them yet. You probably don't get to decide. So, like, do your research and just think about the things that you're going to forget about because in monolith land, you just got it for free. Iteration. This is the thing I want you to take away. You have to be able to iterate on the services platform more than you need to be able to iterate on the individual microservices. And culture, shun. Anybody got a synonym for culture that ends with the English's favorite suffix? I don't have one. Microservices approach thrives in certain cultures, but I want you to also remember that you can cause your culture to evolve into a place that's receptive of these values. Because like the culture that already does all these things, like they're just receptive to these ideas and they're going to do it by default, but you can also move your company in that direction. So I feel like you sometimes, and I liked the last speaker who said, like, just be a rebel. Like sometimes you just introduce it and then like it's kind of like, oh, I don't know where that bacteria came from. Like, oh, it's having a positive effect on our society. Awesome. And one more thing. When you're in the middle of a transition of going from a new job or from a different part of the company to getting exposed to these things, there's a lot of things you can question that, I mean, to this day, I will just be like, oh, I just assumed you had to do it that way because that's what somebody told me like 12 years ago. And these are some of the things I'm questioning, and like some of these are directly opposed on purpose. But if you're in a microservices world where you go to prod in under 5 minutes, do you really want to wait on the code review in order to find out it even works if you have the ability to roll it back faster than you can get a code review? I've been not convinced I like this idea, but then I'm also convinced I love this idea. See, these are very difficult things to question. Like, you have to do it in this order. Testing in prod. Somebody asked, what's our tech stack? It was like a marketing guy, and he wanted to summarize it for someone else. And the VP of engineering was like, oh, it's this, this, and this. And he's like, okay, so how do you test it? How do you test those pieces? And he's like, well, a lot of times we test in prod. We do unit tests, we do integration tests, we do acceptance tests at like lowering levels because those are cheaper as you go up. But the testing in prod thing, I'm like, yeah, you should test in prod. No, you shouldn't. Like, that's terrible. I can't tell someone, I can't actually go, oh, let's go throw it in prod and we'll see what happens. But you can, because it's like, we have 300 microservices running. If I go put in a test of 1 and it's terrible and it takes me 30 seconds to roll back, like, the impact is because we've been trained on these things where like, oh, well, then you'd have to get a code review again, you got to get a release review, you got to update the documentation, you got to do this, and you got to do that. It's just different. And so like the costs of questioning one of these is different. Don't tell whichever company told me I'm not allowed to put that on there. Bring your questions to the open spaces this afternoon. That's what it's all about. I'm not allowing time for questions, so you can take your questions and put them in the open spaces. And I'm done.